Listen up. It's time for a politically entertaining exclusive interview.
Joining us today on Politically Entertaining, she's an Edward R. Murrow Award winner, twice named one of the 50 most powerful people in the Baltimore region, and she has over 30 years of news coverage with WBAL in Baltimore, Maryland. Jayne Miller, I really want to thank you for joining us today.
I appreciate the opportunity.
So last week, Frank and I on the show, we discussed the gun trace task force with the Baltimore Police Department. And, you know, correct me if I'm wrong on my facts. I think is it up to 8 officers that have been found guilty? And
that's correct.
And I know Commissioner Davis is now gone. Is there any chance? Correct. Is there any chance that this could go higher as far as like maybe reaching someone in City Hall or some judges that should have known that, you know, the warrants were not on the up and up? Is there any chance that it can go higher than the actual police department?
That's a good question. The FBI agent, the lead agent in the case, testified during the trial of two of the defectives, Daniel Herschel and Marcus Taylor, which just concluded with their guilty findings by a jury, last week, that the investigation was still, quote, ongoing. And I interviewed the 2 prosecutors who've handled the case, the 2 federal prosecutors this week, and they said, you know, we'll take us wherever the facts lead us. But you don't know. We just don't know. Much of the case against the 8 officers, first there were 7, and then there was a sergeant who was indicted later, that were all members of the Special Enforcement Unit that was known later in its existence as the Gun Trace Task Force, was built upon a wiretap. And the wiretap started with a drug case, a drug trafficking case. It dates all the way back to 2011 when a young woman in a suburban county, Harford County in Maryland, died in a drug overdose, and that led to a federal investigation of a drug trafficking organization, and a wire went up on that organization, and on that wire, the drug wire, here comes Mamadou Gondo, who at the time was a detective in the Baltimore Police Department and happened to be a childhood friend of one of the targets of the drug investigation, one of the drug dealers. And so he was heard on that wire discussing protecting the drug organization and mentioning other members of the Special Enforcement Unit. In particular, he talked about Wayne Jenkins, who's really one of the ringleaders in the case. And that then spawned the corruption investigation. So in April of 2016, there's a separate wire that goes up, and that is on Gondo. So now Gondo's conversations with other members of the gun squad are being recorded. That lasts until August, the wire, and then starting in August of 2016, they put a microphone in his car, in his Baltimore police car. So a whole lot of the case is built upon what was recorded when no one knew they were recording them. And so I say that because unless they've had other wires going that we're not aware of at this point, I don't know if this case would go. One of the relatives of Daniel Herschel, who was convicted by the jury, said, you know, this case went south. It didn't go north, meaning
that's right, that
once Gondo was on that wire, on the drug wire, it went kind of laterally and down to other officers, but it didn't go up to commanders. So that's a good question. A lot of people are asking that question of whether this case has the potential to touch people of higher rank in the police department. And I think it's just unknown at this point.
When I first read about this case, it was like reading a script for Denzel Washington's Training Day or The Wire.
Right.
Or The Wire that was filmed in your city. Are you surprised?
Yeah, but you know what? Well, yeah. I'm really not surprised by it. I was just going through, I've been here a long time, and I was just going through, I'm working on a story, and I was going through, some of the archives of the last decades. And if you live in some of these communities in Baltimore and are familiar with them, you know that this is not a shock. Mm-hmm. People have been complaining about police officers who stop them unnecessarily, take their money, maybe plant drugs. Those kinds of complaints have been going on a long time, not just in the city of Baltimore, but really in any urban area. And so I think what was, if you want to say, astonishing about the Gun Trace Task Force federal case is that you had all of these allegations in one place. And you had 4 former police officers who had all pleaded guilty in the case and agreed to cooperate, sitting on a witness stand under oath and testifying about the misdeeds and the crimes of a Baltimore police unit. So that was somewhat revealing, and really the first time we've seen that kind of at that level. But in terms of the overall theme of the case, which is that police use their power to steal from people, abuse people, and arrest them unnecessarily, that is not something that is a shock to many people in Baltimore communities.
I try my best to watch as much news as I can. I don't want to indict the media, but from what I've seen, it hasn't gotten any national attention that I think it deserves. Have you been surprised?
That's a really
at the
good
lack
question.
Are you surprised at the lack of national attention it's gotten?
Well, we are in Baltimore. Baltimore is kind of the laboratory for the country in many ways. We get a lot of national attention. We got a lot of national attention in 2015 when the unrest occurred after Freddie Gray died.
Right.
It's not, I don't want to say it's a joke, but some people kind of with a wink and a nod say, unless somebody's burning something in Baltimore, then the national media is not going to come here. I was surprised too that it didn't get more national attention, but keep in mind it is a case. It's not a death in custody case. These are on-duty crimes that the gun squad committed, but they are economic crimes. They're robbery, they're extortion, and it's the same kind of case as, a Michael Brown case in Ferguson or an Eric Garner case in New York or a Freddie Gray case in Baltimore, where these are death in custody cases. And maybe that's why it didn't get the kind of attention. But in terms of the level of corruption, many have said that it is among the really largest in the history of law enforcement in this country, because it took down 8 officers at one time. Actually, there's a 9th who's now a Philadelphia police officer, but he has not gone to trial yet. And so I think that's, I don't know. I think you raised a really good question about why it hasn't gotten more national attention.
Hey, Jayne, I'm Frank. I'm going to jump in here. And you mentioned something very interesting. You said that this could have been one of the worst cases of corruption in history. But in your 30 years of covering these different types of stories and doing this investigative reporting, do you have a particular story that you uncover that still sticks with you as like the biggest thing that kind of like stuck out as a big like offense or a big problem that you brought light to?
Oh my God, there are many of them. Honestly, I think that in the scheme of let's just take Baltimore for an example, and this is a cumulative amount of reporting over many years. The Baltimore Police Department is a large organization. It also takes up a huge chunk of the city's budget. And the debate that's going on now, which has gone on before, but probably with a little more vigor right now because of the Gun Trace Task Force case, is how do you get a better result out of an institution in a city like Baltimore that it takes 60 cents of every general fund tax dollar, that has such a large share of funding. I always say, it takes up all the air in the room. We'll know Baltimore is succeeding when the thing you're not talking about all the time is the policing, and crime, et cetera. But I think that, I don't think there's any, on this topic, I don't think there's any one thing. I think it's a cumulative result of decades of reporting of the same thing. I mean, I was just looking at a 2006 story I did on overtime abuse. It's like, we're still talking about this. things haven't changed. It's like it no matter how much attention gets paid to it, and no matter how much people complain about it, it doesn't seem to change. And everybody is waiting for that moment when the ship really turns and we get a more constitutional policing result in Baltimore, where we get a more community policing result, and most importantly, where we get a policing with integrity and effectiveness. And effectiveness is the word that doesn't get used enough. And what I mean by that is where you have effective police presence in areas that are subject to commercial crime, for example, where you have an effective investigation, where you can really bring to justice people who commit violent crime. All of that still awaits in Baltimore in a fashion that people really have confidence in. So I think that over the years, there have been many stories that I've done that kind of stick out, that speak to that point. And we are, everybody's really eager in Baltimore to get to a point where we are starting to see, a real turning point in that.
Wow, that was a really great answer. You mentioned a cumulative effect. One of the things about this type of reporting is it seems like it could take a lot out of you from a standpoint of covering the story and unearthing all the details. Is that something that you've had to deal with over the years, is decompressing and decompartmentalizing, say, when you go home, some of these big cases and big stories that you're breaking?
Yeah, I mean, through the trial, when I sat through the trial of the gun trace task force, it was a lot of work, obviously, but it was also, at the end of the day, you're just like, wow. And yet, I mean, look, I am not one at all to say this is the whole department. I mean, I know many very good professional police officers, and I know they're as embarrassed as anyone that some officers will use the badge as a shield to commit crime. Which is exactly what happened in this case. And so I think that no, I don't think it's the kind of thing where you get so tired of reporting on it, you don't want to report on it anymore. But I do think it somewhat inspires you to really look at broader issues of what are real solutions, which I've done and I am working on now in terms of looking around the country at different models of best practices for the operation of the police department and the internal operation and accountability and all those issues. It really does kind of provoke you to look at are there cities that are doing it differently, and I think that's been a benefit. It's caused everybody to really look and explore that issue. So I think that's really an upside of this case.
You can listen to this interview and our past interviews on our YouTube channel, Politically Entertaining. We're talking to Jayne Miller. She's covered news over the years from Pennsylvania to D.C. You can follow her on Twitter at Jayne Miller, WBAL. Jayne, I watched Baltimore Rising on HBO, the documentary, and I think at the time Commissioner Davis was still in power.
That's right.
And he met with activists during the post-Freddie Gray uprising. Any word on if this new commissioner, I think it's De Souza,
Daryl De Souza, that's correct.
Do you know if he'll continue this type of outreach to the community to try to help close that gap between the community and the police department?
I just listened to his, just today, I did cover it the other day when he had his confirmation hearing before the Baltimore City Council, but he certainly was questioned about that. He is he's an insider of the Baltimore Police Department in the sense that he spent 30 years in the department, very well respected in the communities in which he's worked, and I think there's a lot of confidence in him in trying to rebuild the broken trust between communities and policing in Baltimore. And we'll see. I mean, he's only been on the job now about a month. And there was a lot of questions about his relationship with communities, et cetera. He has, as a result of the gun trace task force case, he has set up a corruption unit, which is to follow up on other names that came up in the course of that trial of officers who weren't charged, but worked with some of these other the officers who were charged. He's also setting up an overtime abuse unit. And I think most importantly, he's set up as one of in his command structure and what he calls an inspector general, which is in charge of the consent decree, the constitutional policing element of this, all of that in one place. And the other thing he said the other day was that he wants to break up he doesn't want to concentrate investigation just with internal affairs, because that has taken a real hit in the gun trace task force case, the ability of that to really root it out, and to kind of spread it around to other components of the police department. So his plan sounds like a very good step in the direction of being able to hold the department to account. If he can execute it, that's what remains to be seen, because he's just taking over. I think that you could really go a long way in having a better result.
I want to thank you for helping bring light to a case that I felt like wasn't getting enough attention. Frank and I try to pride ourselves on covering topics that don't get covered nationally, so we thank you. WBAL's Jayne Miller, we appreciate your time, man.
All right. You have a good night, good weekend.
You too, ma'am.